Hello everybody and welcome to another video of CS301. Today's topic is going to be freedom of speech. And so I thought that it would be a good idea to remind you on what one of the most important parts of our Constitution related to freedom of speech is. And that is the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. So the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And so, to better understand why this was added to the Constitution, we have to kind of put the shoes of the framers and think back when the Constitution was trying to be ratified. A lot of the different states and the framers were afraid that the Constitution gave the new federal government too much power, and that the federal government would use that power to inhibit on individual liberties. And so it is important to see that the word "da" is used a lot, and not just this, but other of the Bill of Rights amendments. And so I'm talking about this kind of "da." The free exercise thereof, the freedom of speech, the right of the people. So when you see "da" there, what it's trying to emphasize is that these are not new rights that we are being granted because of the nice thing, because of the niceness of the framers. No. What it means is that they are pre-existing rights. It means that even if the First Amendment was not in the Bill of Rights, technically speaking, we already have these rights. They are automatically ours, only there for being removed from the government if there was something that said that they had to be removed. And so with that wording, what they're saying is, in a way, it's like they're stating the obvious. They're stating that, yeah, we have these rights, which we are just going to put down in paper, but we already have them. We're just kind of clarifying, okay? And so that's kind of the premise of how the First Amendment came to be another of the amendments in the Bill of Rights. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to take the underlying principles of the First Amendment and of freedom of speech and apply them to modern circumstances. And those modern circumstances are going to be, of course, technology related, right? Nowadays, we have things like print media, like newspapers, magazines, books. We have broadcast media, television, radio. We have telephones. We have the postal service, which kind of affects it and gets spam. And then, of course, we have the internet, which is a big, big thing, and telephones and those kinds of things. And so how do we extend the rights that the First Amendment and these rights that we are supposed to already have, how do those extend into the world of the internet primarily, and what kind of limitations are there? And so, before there were any laws related to this, it was kind of up for interpretation, right? So like, if I can do this as a person, like if I can speak this freely, if I can talk about whatever I want to talk about because of freedom of speech, because of the First Amendment, then I should be able to do the same thing on the internet, right? So these are sort of extensions of existing laws, right? And that works okay until it doesn't work, right? Until somebody pushes the line. And so what that forced the US government, and I'm pretty sure pretty much any other government in the world, to do with things like the internet is for them to create laws that were specifically aimed at these new modes of technology, right? And one of the examples of the first laws that came out was the Telecommunication Act of 1996. Now, that was mostly aimed at actually telephone stuff, relating to like distribution of service areas and restrictions on services that telephone companies could provide. But the part that's kind of important to us is there was a section that said that no provider or user of interactive computer services shall be treated as a publisher of any information provided by another information content provider. And this is very important because normally, if we think about like a magazine, right? If there's an article in a magazine that is, for example, defamatory to somebody, and they decide to sue the magazine for this defamatory article, right? They're suing the magazine or they're suing the publisher, right? Yeah, sure, they could sue the author, but the reason why they sue the magazine is because the magazine is the one that's in charge of the author and the editor that were involved in that article that is defamatory, right? So the publisher, being the magazine, is responsible. You know, why did you let this through your editorial team or whatever, right? And so if we extend, you know, people said, does that extend to internet providers? So does AT&T, Cox, Comcast, or Time Warner, or Quest, or any of the internet providers that are currently out there today, are those individual companies responsible for whatever a user accesses in the internet via their service, right? So like, if I go, you know, on my internet provider, you know, I use my internet, I have internet at home, right? So let's say that I had, let's say on my phone, I have let's say I have Verizon phone, okay? So I have a data plan. And then that, you know, I go on my phone and I go and I watch a movie illegally. I torrent a movie, pirate a movie, and then I watch it on my phone. That is a crime, right? I'm violating copyright law, technically speaking. Who is responsible? Is Verizon responsible for letting me have access to that information? And so what the Telecommunication Act of 1986 said is no. Verizon is not responsible because all they're doing is they're giving you access to the internet. And they're providing you access to other information content providers. In this case, the website or torrents work in a peculiar way, but let's say that I to make it easier, let's say that I access it through a website. Like there's a bunch of websites out there that say like, watch movies free here, right? So, they probably just show ads to get money or whatever. But the point is, that website is the one that's giving me the illegal movie. So they're responsible for it, but the Verizon is not responsible for letting me access that website. So essentially, it protected companies and that were internet providers from being in trouble for whatever users were accessing, right? And so this is essentially good because it sort of eased responsibility on a provider to have to monitor what you're accessing to be able to control it, because now it's not their problem, you know, if you're accessing illegal stuff or not, right? They will just forward your information so that they can DMCA you directly. And that's kind of what happens nowadays. So that was kind of like the first of the acts that were related to this. Next, we had the Communication Decency Act of 1996. And this was the first major internet censorship law, okay? So this was from the same year as the other one, but this one was aimed at controlling what was on the internet. Now, if any of you were alive during this time, and I was, the internet was essentially the Wild West. And I think partially still is today, but it's a little bit less than it was back then. You could get pretty much anything you wanted on the internet, legal or not. And so this was a big problem because people were exposed to it. Of course, the internet wasn't as big as it is now in terms of usage, but like I had a computer and I had dial-up internet, and basically I was a little kid and I could go into the wrong website and watch things I shouldn't, very easily. Literally, I could mistype. I could tell you a personal story without giving many details, but there was, we all know that if you want to find out information about the White House, you can go to, I believe it's whitehouse.org, right? Or .gov, actually. Let me check, actually. I haven't been to the White House website in a while. I just kind of Googled it. Whitehouse.gov, yes. And so that website is whitehouse.gov. This is a website for, reading information about the current president or other executive branch related stuff. I'm looking at the website right now. They have a tab on economy, national security, budget, immigration. There's probably like a contact the White House kind of thing, and then they have a picture of our president. So that's pretty much the government website, okay? Well, it turned out that there was another website that was very, very close to that website. Because back then, most people thought about the internet as like just .com, right? Well, it turned out that this was actually a pornographic website. And so it was very easy for somebody of a young age to mistype from going to this domain and going to this domain instead by accident, right? And so our teacher actually made a point of telling us, don't go to that website, or make sure you don't type the wrong domain name, because otherwise you're going to end up going to unwanted website. And what did half the class do at that point in time? They typed the wrong domain name. And now we had a major problem of, like, you know, pretty much everybody's computer looking at obscene content, right? And so that was a bit of a problem. And so that was essentially what was happening in that time. And so essentially what the legislators tried to do, and again, this was very new technology, so you can't blame them for not trying, but they, even today, I would say that some legislators don't quite understand just how complicated the internet is, right? But they tried. And what they first tried to do was to censor the internet by saying, okay, we are not going to allow the internet to have obscene material or indecent material, okay? So even though it's called a censorship law, what it was really was an anti, and I'll post a link to a Wikipedia article on this act so you can read more about it, because we don't have time to go into it that in depth. But it was basically an anti-obscenity, and it was an anti-indecency. Indecency, like that. Okay, obscenity related to pornographic stuff essentially, and indecency was related actually to profanity as well. And so the problem was that I believe, I mean, you can read the article in detail, but I believe the aim was to protect people like me, like children at the time. Okay, but they weren't that careful how they did that, and they just kind of said, like, no obscene content, no indecent content. And it turned out that it didn't just stop at obscene content. Like, they literally banned profanity. So, like, it became immediately unlawful to post profanity on the internet. You couldn't curse. If you said a bad word on the internet, technically speaking, you are committing a crime. Okay? And so that's pretty extreme. Like, because while I would discourage you from doing this, you can go and curse anywhere you want, potentially, right? You can go walking on the street and curse all day, all night. And it is absolutely legal under the First Amendment. There's been court cases about this, and the court sided with people that they can curse. But now you couldn't do it on the internet. So what happened? It went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court pretty much struck this down and said, this is unconstitutional to do this. You overreached, the federal government, unconstitutional, has overreached and tried too far, gone too far with the First Amendment. In addition to that, it has something that is known as a chilling effect. So you might see this word a lot and might not understand what it is. So I guess I'll also post a Wikipedia article on this, but it's basically a discouragement of your natural and legal rights. So when you see that something has a chilling effect, so when an act of Congress, when they claim that this act of Congress, if passed, is going to have a chilling effect on X and Y, what they're saying is that while it might not be unconstitutional, while it might not block your rights, it's going to discourage the legitimate use of them. Okay? So essentially, it's not forbidding you from exercising your rights, but it's written in a way that it's really going to discourage you from doing it. Okay? And so that's pretty much all I'll say about that, but you can read more about it later. So in this case, it had both chilling effects and it was also unconstitutional. And so it was ruled out. So what did the people in Washington decide to do again? Well, they tried to just basically change the law and put it up again. Even though they said it was unconstitutional, they were like, whatever, we're just going to rename the law into something called CIPA, which means Child's Internet Protection Act, and basically put the law out there again. So, however, they did learn their lesson that being careful about not overreaching. And so essentially what they did is, okay, instead of saying, well, we're going to forbid these things flat out and make them a crime because we know that's unconstitutional, we're going to try Plan B, which typically is done a lot of the times, and I'm sure you've heard about this being used for other things, and that is go where it hurts, which is the money, right? So they said, okay, we can't make. And by the way, this act was two-part. I believe the first part of it was like in the late 90s, and then eventually the version that kind of worked out, the one that was ruled okay, was in like early 2000s. But I think they're both called CIPA. And so what they did is they said, okay, we can't make it illegal, but what we can do is we can cut funding. So they said, we are going to require, or not require, well, I guess require, require will be a good word. We are going to require the schools and libraries that participate in certain federal programs to install filtering software. Now, if you don't know what filtering software is, it's typically a program that you run in your computer, and what it does is it allows you to essentially censor certain words or certain websites that are on a list of like bad things, which could be considered obscene or indecent or anything like that. Okay, but what they're doing is they're basically saying that I don't know. I think the first one was in 1998. In 1998, they said, so in 1998, they first started by saying it will be a federal crime. They said it's a federal crime for commercial websites to be made available to minors. Okay? So if there's a commercial porn website and it's accessible to anybody and a minor gets in there, that's illegal. So the fact that they made it so easy for minors to get there, it's a crime, right? So there must be a way for them to be stopped. And so they found that to be unconstitutional because they said it was too broad, again, chilling effect, and would restrict an entire country to the standards of like a more conservative community, okay? And so that didn't work out. So in 2000, which was the version that I'm talking about now, what they did is they said, okay, if you want to get your federal funding, which pretty much every single state gets federal funding because of income taxes and whatnot, just federal taxes. What they're going to do is they're going to say you have to put these filtering software in all the schools to prevent them from accessing obscene websites, and if you don't do it, then we're going to cut off your federal funds for education. And that pretty much was quite effective because now the schools, sure, it's not illegal. I mean, you can go ahead and not have those filters. There's not going to be jail. There's not going to be fines, nothing. But we're just not going to give you the money. And by cutting the funding, then the schools are basically broke, which they can't handle. So they kind of twisted their arm where it hurt with the money, and that's how they got them. However, as I was reading on Wikipedia earlier, it says that as of 2007, approximately 1/3 of libraries had chosen to forego the federal E-rate and certain type of LSTA funds, so they would not be required to institute filtering. So technically speaking, while this was effective in getting 2/3 of libraries and schools to basically jump in and actually have this filter, there's still a 1/3 that chose not to. So, like I said, they're not forced to put the filter, but if they don't get the filter, they're going to get their funding cut. And these people said, we don't care. We'd rather have, I suppose, the no filtering or no censorship, right? So this is pretty much what they did, and this worked out. This was upheld in court, that they could do this, because again, it was just money related. So I suppose when a law doesn't work, the second thing you can do is cut the funding. So this being an ethics class, you can go ahead and decide whether that was the right way to approach it or not. Okay, so before I go any further, I would like to talk about freedom of speech in general. And so what are some of the principles with freedom of speech that are okay and are not okay, even before the internet? And so first, I suppose I can talk about what is legal and what is not. So, and this is of course based, because here's the thing, they kind of, when the Constitution was ratified, it was up for pretty much people to just interpret what is okay and is not okay, right? And then if a DA or something or police arrested you for something, and then you argued to a court and said, no, but this is okay, and then it goes to the Supreme Court, that's only when we actually start to interpret what is okay and what is not okay, right? And so a lot of what I'm about to tell you is based on decisions of Supreme Courts that they said, okay, this is okay, this is not okay. And so The main guidelines are that, first of all, anonymous speech is protected. Advocating illegal acts is actually legal, so it's protected. So if you advocate, so if you go on the internet potentially and say, I mean, that's extending it to the internet, but that's pretty much what happens. If you go to the internet and advocate for somebody to be beat up or attacked or something, which would normally be a crime, assault is a crime, that technically advocating for that act is illegal. Sorry, it's legal. It's perfectly legal to do. Okay? Now, while it's legal, there are some special scenarios, because I mean, I'm sure you have read of like people, you know, advocating for certain government officials to be attacked, and then like the Secret Service gets involved. So I know, with a big asterisk after the statement, but technically speaking, advocating illegal acts is usually legal. Okay, that's a better way of saying it. Usually. On the other hand, there have been some restrictions that have been allowed on advertising. So not everything is allowed to be said. So I guess the biggest example is, you know, if you advertise a product and you're being misleading, then you can actually get in trouble for that. So those are the kind of restrictions that they have put on free speech, because technically speaking, free speech says that I can lie all I want. I can say whatever. I can say, look, I'm selling you this cleaning product and it is going to like clean this thing immediately and like open, like, you're even going to be able to time travel with this thing or something, whatever. You're going to time travel to when it was new and it'll just magically clean itself, right? So I could say that. Freedom of speech protects me from saying all of that. But now, as an advertiser, when you're advertising a product, they did place some restrictions on that kind of stuff. So those are some of the restrictions that they have on free speech. Libel and direct threats are not protected, technically speaking. So while it's okay to advocate for an illegal act, when you're doing a direct threat on someone, so if you say like, I am going to beat you up versus like, let's beat up this person, technically speaking, when you say, hey, let's go beat up like Mario from Mario Bros, that's okay. But if you're saying like, I'm going to beat you up or I'm going to beat Mario up, I guess if you were talking to Mario or something, then that would be not protected. Okay. Also, inciting violence is technically illegal as well. So it's a big gray line, essentially, okay? But there are some limitations of that. Primarily, most of the efforts on the internet censorship, though, haven't really been based on advocating for violence or things like that, but they're mostly on, again, obscene material. And that's why most of these acts relate to that. But freedom of speech should be understood to cover not just words, but also pictures, arts, and pretty much any form of expression out there. And it's very important to say this as well. The restrictions that the First Amendment puts on freedom of speech is on the government. So it restricts the power of the government, okay? That's very, very important to make a point of. That it's restricting the power of the government. It is not restricting individuals or private businesses. So, what does that entail? Well, the military has like video game programs in it to promote like video games as opposed for military stuff. And so they were doing like an esport competition, okay? And so they were streaming it on Twitch. And there was a couple of protesters that didn't like the fact that the military was using video games to attract people to potentially have them be recruited in the future. And so, if I recall correctly, some people that were protesting were writing messages on Twitch protesting the fact that this was happening. And so the moderators of that Twitch stream decided to remove the people that were protesting from it. Okay? So when they did that, they went to a lawyer and complained. And so even though Twitch has the right to remove whoever they want because they're a private business and they're not the government, here it's kind of a weird gray line, because technically speaking, because this is the military's Twitch channel and it's sort of an extension of the government because of that, then it's kind of the government that was infringing on the free speech of the protesters. So now it's kind of like a legitimate issue of like, this wasn't really Twitch as a private business limiting their speech. It was the government. So I suppose the same could be said about when I do classes on Twitch, right? But I'm an employee of the state government, not federal government. So that's kind of a little bit different, but not that much. But anyways, if you would like to read more about that, Google that and you can find out. I actually have no idea how far that went because it's pretty recent. Maybe they just all stopped and settled, or it's actually an ongoing like litigation or something. I have no idea. But it was something that kind of was interesting about that. But the important thing to remember is that the First Amendment is restricting the power of the government, not of private businesses or individuals. Okay? So, moving on. Let's talk a little bit more about video games while we're at it, actually. Yeah. So, there was another case with video games where California created a law that banned the sale or rental of violent video games to minors. Okay, so California was like, no violent games to minors. Okay, and actually, it turned out that in 2011, so this went all the way to the Supreme Court of, in this case, of California, I suppose. So it was the state Supreme Court. They ruled that this is a violation of the First Amendment. So if a kid wants to buy a violent video game, they're well within their right. So this, of course, opens an entire different argument of the First Amendment of saying, do adults and children have the same rights under the First Amendment? And I'm not going to get into that, but it's a big discussion about that as well. So just thought I'd mention that since it's interesting, since it's video game related, I suppose, since we were just talking about video games. But let's see, what else? Oh, let's talk about spam. So spam's a big thing related to the internet, right? So what is spam? I hope most of you have heard of spam, but spam is typically unsolicited bulk emails. That's usually what we consider spam. Most commonly, it's a commercial advertisement of something, but it can also be potentially scams or things like that. You know, it doesn't have to be actually like a legitimate advertisement. It could be a scam to steal your personal information, or they're putting in a virus in there, a lot of things, okay? But basically, spam angers people because of the content, which might be obscene in a way. You know, if you get pills for this or that, that's kind of annoying. Or also just the way that it's sent. And so that brings up a free speech issue, right? Because like the advertisers have freedom of speech to spam, I suppose, but spam imposes a cost on the recipient because he has to filter through legitimate content in their inboxes from like spam. And this isn't something that is potentially new to email. Go look at your mailbox and you will find, especially during an election or something, I mean, you will literally get like billions of flyers related to political advertisements, right? And so trying to sort through all of that just to find like a paycheck or something can be a bit of a pain. So the question is, can we limit these people? And furthermore, for the digital version, certain companies like Google, Yahoo, and other email providers provide you with a spam filter, right? Which most of them are actually pretty automated. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't really get any spam email anymore in the last few years. That's because if there's any spam, it usually gets automatically flagged and sent to spam. If anything, sometimes legitimate stuff gets flagged to spam and you got to check your spam folder. So the question is, does a spam filter violate free speech? And it turns out that they claim that it does not, because free speech does not technically require anyone to listen. Free speech says that you can speak all of you want. However, free speech doesn't force anybody to listen to the stuff that you're saying. And so that's kind of the end of that. In terms of the government, they have, of course, getting involved in this with anti-spam laws. The one that I am aware of is let me first write laws correctly, is the CAN Spam Act, which is kind of like, I feel like they were creating a meme when they created this. this thing. It stands for Controlling the Assault of Non-Solicited Pornography and Marketing Act. They must really like be shaping, like, it wasn't an accident that this is abbreviated CAN spam. Like, I feel like they come up with the acronym first and they just fill it up with words that are related or something. But anyways, this basically targets commercial spam. However, it was criticized because it did not ban all kinds of spam and it legitimized some of spam. Okay, but the problem with the internet is more of the fact that it's a global network. So even if in the US we have these great laws and, you know, certain regulations, and everything is great, I'm not saying it is, but even if it was, it's only in the US that that's the case. But the internet is a global thing. And so that makes it a lot harder to regulate when it's beyond your domain of government. Okay? So yeah, we might come back to that in a little bit. But now let's talk a little bit about what gets posted on the internet, right? So on the internet, you get a lot of great things that are posted, but you also get some things that maybe are a little bit more sensitive when they get posted. And that in specific, I am referring to leaks, right? So the internet has been used for the last few years as a way of leaking sensitive material, right? And what is a sensitive material? Well, something that is of value to society or a risk to certain individuals or to society. An example of a website commonly known for posting these kinds of leaks is WikiLeaks. And you can go ahead and Google to find a link to that. I'm not going to go ahead and link it to that. But let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons of a leak. Okay? So on one side, you know, leaks can be useful for exposing certain potential problems with a government, a company, or even an individual. However, you're exposing things that perhaps you're not legally allowed to expose without maybe a subpoena or something. And so a good question to ask is, does the value of informing the public of controversial or sensitive information outweigh the dangers and risks? And so that's a question for you to think about, right? Furthermore, who is responsible when there's a leak? Like, and it's posted on the internet. So like WikiLeaks. Is WikiLeaks responsible for the content that's posted there? You know, the operators of the websites that are hosting the leaks, are they responsible? Should they be prosecuted for it? All they're doing is hosting the information, right? So that's a big question to have as well. Talking about leaks, typically these leaks are usually posted anonymously, right? So let's talk a little bit about anonymity. If you want to read a little bit about the origins of anonymity and those kind of things, and we already kind of talked a little bit about anonymity, is you can go ahead and read the Common Sense and the Federalist Papers. But what I want to talk about are the pros and cons of anonymity. So on the good side, the positive side, anonymity will protect political speech. So it'll protect your speech in general, protect you against what is it protecting you against? It's protecting you against retaliation or embarrassment, you know? So that's good. It also allows you to anonymize services, you know? So it can protect not just individuals, but businesses, law enforcement, or even government. On the downside of anonymity is that it also protects criminals and antisocial activities, right? It can aid in fraud, harassment, extortion. So let me go ahead and write that. So criminals, harassment, extortion, distribution of obscene material, potentially even theft, and copyright infringement. And while it can be good for the government in a good way, it can be good and it can be bad in a way for us because it can mask illegal surveillance by government agencies, right? And so Is anonymity protected? Well, for that I'll refer you to the last discussion that we had. So, going back to the idea of the internet being global, and this is the last thing that I will talk about, is that it's good because it can protect the internet's integrity from being limited to one government, you know? However, there have been attempts by authoritarian governments, dictatorships, those kind of things, or bad governments per se, to impede the flow of information throughout history. There's been cases, I don't really want to name anybody because that's not the point of this class, but there have been cases of governments that have tried to limit the access to the internet of their citizens. Why? Because the internet allows people to see, you know, pretty much everything they want to see. And it might be things that may make that government look bad, right? They might try to limit the flow of information, which might basically disagree with the propaganda that they might have, right? So that's one sort of pro of the internet being global. The con is that some countries have an internet backbone within their country and are more easily able to block specific sites, which will not just affect that country, but could affect globally, right? So like, imagine that Yahoo.com was hosted in the imaginary country of, what is the name of the Mushroom Kingdom, right? From Mario. Okay? So in Mushroom Kingdom, we have Yahoo. Mushroom Kingdom gets a coup d'etat by Baase, and now they decide to shut down Yahoo. But that gets shut down, or not just shut down, but maybe they don't get shut down. They just get censored. So they only allow certain pieces of information to be posted on Yahoo News. So now they're censoring Yahoo not just for their own citizens of Mushroom Kingdom, but for the entire world, because that's where Yahoo was being hosted, right? And so this causes a problem worldwide. And there's nothing that other countries can do because, you know, Yahoo was being hosted there. Now let's put it the other way around. Let's say that, you know, there was Google. Let's say Google was being hosted in, it's kind of hard to think of these modern names, but let's just say that Google was hosted in the US, right? And the US is allowing really negative stuff about Baase being posted there. Like Bowser's really bad dictator, etc., etc. The Mushroom Kingdom as a government, as a country, has all the right in the world, minus, you know, natural rights and all that stuff we were talking about today. But they have technically all the right in the world because they're the government to limit what is on the internet, right? Like they technically have. I mean, whether that is right or wrong, they do. But so can they ask Google to stop these articles? And Google's like, nope, I am in the US, and in the US I can say whatever I want about anybody, you know, in my news articles. And so now, you know, Bowser's really angry because Google's posting all these bad things. So there's two sides to the coin. Obviously, I would say that it's good that bad things are being exposed about Bowser, but I also think that at the same time, each country has a right to control some certain level of things. So yeah. Okay. So pro is that the global nature of the internet helps to avoid censorship, and barriers in one country can be circumvented very easily. And on the con side, it does create censorship because it makes it easy for one nation to impose standards on other nations if the content is hosted in that nation, right? So if Google is hosted in the US and the US decides like all of a sudden like this is not okay, then it's affecting it for the full world. Are there ways around that? Sure, you can host Google in multiple, you know, countries and things like that. But that's kind of something that, you know, you have to kind of actively do if you wanted to avoid it, which I think is what like the Pirate Bay does to avoid being shut down. They keep moving between different countries, right? So I'll go ahead and summarize by saying the global net avoids censorship, but also creates it. And again, it avoids it by having, you know, content being hosted in other less restrictive countries than the very restrictive one. And it creates it because it makes it easy for one nation to expose restrictive standards for a certain website. Okay? There are some cases here that were listed on the book, which I guess I'll mention. And those were, for example, Skype. Apparently, the Chinese government required a modified version of Skype that they could listen to. There's also Yahoo and the French government. So Yahoo, eBay, and others had to make decisions to comply with foreign laws. So that's interesting to point out. And so a big argument, and one that I would like you to think about, is this. We have a situation that happened to me as well, because I was in China. China limits certain access to certain websites, and I saw it in firsthand when I was there. And so the question is, a company like Google, you know, by complying with the more restrictive Chinese regulations, I can go and say, well, Google's evil because they are complying with these restrictive censorship laws, right? So like, I'm not going to support Google because they're evil, blah, blah, blah. That's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that Google can argue and say that some access is better than no access, right? So Apple, another example, you know, there's a limited, the same apps that are available in the global US or the US market are not the same ones that are available potentially in China, because there's a certain limitation of some apps that are okay and are not okay. So I can go and say, well, I'm going to go boycott Apple because they're playing that game, you know? But at the same time, Apple can say, well, hey, we can either just cut off complete access, or we can at least give them some access, which is better than nothing, right? So the big thing is here that companies who do businesses in countries that are more controlling for the internet have to comply with local laws. Otherwise, they're criminals over there. And so there's two sides to that argument, as I said. So I'm not going to take sides, but I'll let you think about that. As a last thing, and this is going to kind of go into the discussion, is a brief discussion on net neutrality. And I'm going to post a link that you can kind of read to get a summary of what net neutrality is. But the simple explanation behind it is that right now, there are no laws regarding as to how providers can control the flow of information of the internet. And by that I mean, suppose that a provider said, I'm selling you internet for $50 a month. However, if you want to use the website called youtube.com, you want to watch videos on YouTube, you have to pay an extra $10. And so if you don't, you can use the internet, but whenever you go to youtube.com and try to watch a video, it's going to get what is known as throttled. I believe that's how you spell throttled, something like that. And what it means is it's going to get slowed down intentionally. So actively, the provider is going to slow down certain connections to certain websites. Now, why would they do this? Well, because they want to sell you the $10 bonus, right? Or better yet, most internet providers are providers of cable, right? They do it via cable, like coaxial cable. And so they probably provide cable TV, such as like, what are some TV providers like cable? Well, Cox has Cox TV, I suppose. DirecTV satellites doesn't really count, although it's owned by AT&T now. But anyways, the point is that they provide you with TV services. you may not be using those TV services because you can watch all your shows on the internet via Netflix, for example. And so what do? They throttle Netflix to discourage you from using that, and instead buy their services or pay an extra fee to be able to watch Netflix quickly. And so this, of course, you might be like, what the heck? This is very unethical, right? For them to do this. Okay, so in that case, the government came in and said, all right, we're going to write a law that says that the providers cannot throttle or cannot unjustly slow down any specific communication that is happening on the internet. Like, you can't intentionally throttle specific domains. Like, say, okay, I'm going to throttle Netflix, or I'm going to throttle YouTube, and so on. Everything has to be fair. Basically, don't give anything priority, which would be the other side of the coin. No priority, no throttling, no blocking, and basically no interfering of any form. Okay? So I guess I'll put it here. So no throttling. No priority. No blocking, like flat out blocking certain domains, minus, like, I suppose, obscene content, but technically, as we said, they're not required to do that as a provider. And I suppose just no interfering in general. No interfering. And so that is basically what the proponents of net neutrality do. The government to pass a law that says that they are not allowed to do this. The other side of the coin says, the people that are against net neutrality say that the government shouldn't be involved in this. That, yes, the cable providers, internet providers, should not do this, but that it's not the government's decision to do this. It should be something that the consumers kind of fight. If a certain company is going to throttle me for using this, and I'm going to go ahead and switch to another one, right? Assuming, of course, that there's more than one provider for you in that area. And so, again, I'm going to avoid taking a side on net neutrality, but one of the big arguments, I suppose, that you can read more about it on this website, but it was mentioned here, and I thought it was and I have heard it said a lot, is that by not implementing net neutrality, is going to help innovation in the internet. I'm not sure as to the how or why, but they're basically saying free market capitalism will rule, and basically, competition will basically solve this by itself, right? Will it solve it or will it not? I don't know. But that is a big issue with net neutrality. That's where this is coming from. Okay? So essentially, can you restrict certain access, or does it have to be fair? And the better question is, how do you even make it fair? Right? How do you guarantee that you're not going to throttle? Does that mean you have to look into the content, or you just don't look and hope for the best? Like it's a difference between there not being regulations and being forced to make something fair. Because when you're being forced to make something fair, you may have to take an active role as to ensuring that, which may mean that you have to actively looking at what you're giving your customers to see if it's fairly being given, and that could be a privacy invasion, right? So maybe that could be one of the arguments against, I suppose, any net neutrality laws. Thank you for watching. Until next time, I hope you have a great day.